Okay, class. Your next project is going to be another still life, but you're going to have a more complex composition. And so again, I'll send you images to choose from. If you run across an image that you find you'd like to use, just send it to me so I can make sure that it's going to work for you. But what I wanted to do so is to not take a whole lot of time with the demonstration is I wanted to add more complexity to this one here. And so what I've decided to do is to take a couple of other images that you've probably seen and take and borrow from each one to change the composition here. Okay, so I'm going to use this kind of cool gray. It's got a little blue in it for the bottom, and then I'd like to use this. It's like almost an ochre avocado-ish color for the background wall, and to also maybe change the lightness and darkness to add a little bit more complexity. The images that I sent you for the first project had no background, just the cast shadow. And so now we're going to become a little more elaborate with the design situation by using negative space. Of course, some of the images that I send you will have more than one object, or the object will have some other components to it. So now one thing that you may realize, or maybe if you're real sharp to pick up on it, but I did have to tape over about 1/4 of an inch of the edge here because some junk got on it. Yeah, it was a little upsetting, but the show must go on. So I taped over it, so it might look a little smaller than it did in the previous videos. I've also added more tape because it did pull away a little, but it's got a nice flat surface, which is what we want. So keep an eye on that as you're waiting for it to dry. Make sure if you need to replace more tape, just expand the boundary and add another edge of tape to it, and it should flatten out nicely. Okay. So let me get started with the background, and I'm going to use some water. I'm going to start at the top. Just like with painting on an easel, I don't want to work in an area that's wet, over an area that's wet. So I'd like to start here and then come down. All right, because if this area is wet, even though I'm not resting my hand, just the idea of this being wet, and if my hand accidentally touches it, I'm going to disturb the evenness of the coat if it's an even coat. Okay, now this viewpoint at the peach makes us looking down at it. All right, so I don't want to have a really large area of wall, because then that's going to be a little peculiar. So I'm going to wet this here. Now I'm not going to wet it a lot like I did in the previous demonstration of that landscape. Okay, I just want to wet it so that when I apply my color, I'm going to be able to have it dry and not take as long, because I'm going to double layer the color. So I'm first going to start out with a nice light layer of yellow ochre. I may add just a tad of yellow to it to lighten it up some more. And I'm just going to drop it right in here. Yeah, that's lovely. I like that color. I can see where my wet edge stopped. So it's important to know. Okay, I want to make the corner up here a little darker. So I'm going to add just a bit more ochre by itself right here, just so that it's not a real even application So I'm going to let that dry a little and soak into the paper. And then I'm going to layer a little green on it so that it has that layered look. And it won't be a real mechanically even surface. Because after all, your peach is not looking that way. It's got a lot of texture in it. So let me go ahead and start to establish a little of the color in the bottom area. Now in the bottom, I'm really going to need to saturate that because it's so light. Okay. So I'm going to start at the bottom here. And of course, if I get some on my peach, it's not going to matter because it's not going to loosen. But I don't want to make it a habit of doing that. I'm going to leave a little gap because that area where the yellow ochre is wet. So I don't want the yellow ochre seeping down. I come right up to my pear, or my peach, excuse me. And of course, I do want to have a little application over my cast shadow. All right, let me go a little higher now. Okay, now I'm going to dip into some blue. I'm going to use ultramarine. It's got a real cold kind of look to it in that photograph, so that's why ultramarine is a better choice. And I'm just going to drop it in. Need more than that. Push it around. Now, of course, cast shadows are transparent, so I need a little of this over the shadow because if there's a slight trace of it in the floor covering and my cast shadow is on that same floor, well, then that's going to mean there's got to be a trace of that color in the shadow. Let me drop a little more here. Come back. And because of the direction of the cast shadow here on this side, that means the light source is coming from this direction. So I'm going to have a little more of the ultramarine more heavily deposited over here on this side and less of it on the right side to indicate that there is a direction of light entering the picture plane. Right? I still think that could go darker. So once again, let me pick a little more ochre, or not ochre, but the ultramarine. Pull it up this direction. And pull it to the light. Now I'm going to slowly get close to my yellow up here. All right. And don't worry, this blue is so transparent with as much water as I have in it, and how much water is in the paper, that if I get some right along the edge, the outer edge of my peach, it's not really going to show. Okay. But I will exaggerate. Take a little paper towel here, and I just want this to fade out a little more, so let me take a little water and a paper towel and just soften that transition. Okay? And I'm going to strengthen that cast shadow for just a tiny bit more of the blue, and of course I'm going to add a little more red to it later on as well once this dries. Since I've strengthened the dark on this side of the composition, I think that's going to require strengthening the shadow. There we go. Let it fade on out. Okay. Okay, let me just again come back a little closer to that yellow line there. All right, now I'm going to jump back into the yellow area, and I'm just going to drop a little green, except I'm going to also soften it with a little yellow so it's not quite so emerald or phthalo-ish. Really dilute it with quite a bit of water here. I just tap this over the paper towel to take some of the pigment out so that I can just use that first stroke, and then I'm going to push it back and blend it out some so I don't lose all my ochre. Okay, so now I've got a little bit of that kind of greenish. Let me get this right here. Come down. And now I've created just a little bit more space in the image. I think I may try to I think I'd also like to maybe insert a suggestion of a pattern here as well. So I'm going to use a little of the sponge, and then I'm even going to take a little yellow ochre and just for the sake of design interest, I'm going to keep the bottom ultramarine area smooth, and I'm going to suggest this texture in the background there. So it looks like it's a wallpaper, textured fabric on the wall. There we go. Okay, let that dry up. I don't want to get too fussy with it. There we go. Okay, now let that dry. Now, the only other thing I'm going to do, and at this stage, is I know I said you never use white, but there are times when it's unavoidable. You know, you've got rules, the rules of watercolor, and then, of course, just like in any other art making process or design choice, you break rules. Okay, so I'm going to soften this up with a little white, and I'm also going to take a cue from this pear photograph here, and I'm going to change up my peach, because you see how there's a darkening along the edge on one side. And I think with the cast shadow being more prominent now, that the back edge of your peach should be slightly darker to help give it a little more form and a little more volume. So regardless of the image you're working from, make sure you really look closely at shadows and at light. Okay, light and cast shadows. Sometimes they have color, like this has a little red in it, and then here it doesn't have any red in it. It looks bluer here. And look at the light, okay? And also look at edges. See, there's very little of any shadow over that edge, but we see more of it happening here. So keep an eye on that. And on the next phase, I'm going to show you that the changes with the addition of white. It's just like adding any other pigment. I just want to add some of that over the top, maybe cool this down a little, and also allow the white of the paper to make a smoother transition. And then I'm going to darken that outer edge. So I'm going to do that real quick, and then when the camera comes back on, this will be dry, and I'll be able to show you the white over the top of that surface.